everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. So, happy Valentine's Day. And what I wanted to do was to move us a little bit more quickly through short story, now that we've spent some time talking about how to read short story, and also give you some suggested paper topics. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the paper over the next few classes. But your first paper won't be due until we've reached the ending of the short story unit and you've had an opportunity to hand in your first journal, where I'm asking you to select 3 of the short stories from the short story unit and write about a page or so in response to each of the short stories. An informal response, it could even be bullet points, of your thoughts and your questions and your observations. Certainly you can utilize information from these videos, from the class discussion forum questions as well, and your own thoughts. And I evaluated on a checkmark system without thinking about grammar or mechanics, just content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And hopefully those journals might help inform some of your thinking for writing a formal academic paper, which would be an investigative analysis of an element within one of the short stories. And I had indicated that you are free to create your own paper topic, so you can try out ideas in your journal if you'd so like. But I would also be providing you with paper topics as well, or suggested paper topics. And you can see that in our syllabus and other documents folder, I have uploaded suggested paper topics, the handout that I would have distributed to you if we were meeting in person. And I'm going to go through the handout right now. Paper number 1 is a critical paper. In other words, you don't need to consult outside resources. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, please come speak with me. But of course, a research paper is more challenging because you still need to incorporate your own ideas as well as document the resources from outside of your ideas. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins, but as I like to say, as long as it needs to be in order to support your thesis, the position upon which reasonable people could disagree, and that's what you are arguing about, to try to support your position over the course of the paper. So what I did was I developed 8 topics as just suggestions, and of course, as I indicated, you can write on your own topic. And it's always a good idea to approve your topic with me before you begin to do any kind of serious composing, especially if you're creating your own topic. The syllabus talks about specific paper formatting specifications, in that it should have a cover page, which is a separate sheet of paper that lists my name and your name, the paper title, the due date, that it should be typed double space with 1-inch margins, pages should be numbered. And again, we'll review this when we get a little bit closer to writing the paper, but do note that there's a section on the syllabus about that. So, if you'll remember, we began our short story unit by talking about a sorrowful woman. So, I generated a question, or attempted to generate a question, for each of the short stories. And the first question would be, discuss the theme of isolation in Godwin's A Sorrowful Woman, talking about how the woman isolates herself, but more importantly, why the woman isolates herself. And many of these topics can be mixed and matched so that you could utilize them for other stories as well. The second question I formulated was on Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, to discuss the use of symbolism in Chopin's Story of an Hour. And again, certainly most, if not all, of the texts we're reading discuss symbolism. It's a question of what symbolism is used and why. And we talked a little bit about the symbolism of freedom associated with this particular text. In terms of A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, discuss the theme of death in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. We had talked about how that story not only shows us literal deaths through the death of Emily's father and Homer, and then finally Emily herself, but Emily clinging on to a dead past and living in a dead past and unable to accept the fact that the world has moved on. You can do a compare and contrast. I wouldn't do more than 2 stories, though, because this is a relatively short paper of only 4 to 5 pages. Discuss, or I should say, number 4, compare the theme of love in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily and Van der Zee's The Secret Sorrow. And you remember we had talked about A Secret Sorrow as an example of formulaic fiction, which is how you would probably address it in this particular paper. And while A Rose for Emily does have predictable elements that could be formulaic, because of the mixed chronology, it is not nearly as predictable as something like A Secret Sorrow, and certainly the themes are much more complex than anything we would see in A Secret Sorrow. Or, with Young Goodman Brown, which I wanted to begin talking about today, discuss the theme of ambiguity. There are lots of different ways to examine Young Goodman Brown, but one of the ways that's most common is the fact that we can't come up with a definitive conclusion as to whether or not that witch meeting occurred. And that's very deliberate on the part of the author, because the point is not whether or not there was a witch meeting. The point is how and why Goodman changes in his belief that there's a witch meeting. And as I said, I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. Or 7, discuss the theme of battle in Ellison's Battle Royal. I guess you can tell from the title that obviously battle is important, and certainly we've seen lots of different kinds of battles in the other pieces. But as we will talk about with Battle Royal, there is a literal boxing match, and that is a metaphor for the symbolic boxing match that basically these characters participate in on a daily basis, the discrimination, the racism, and the classism that they have to confront, and how they try to survive in a system that basically is rigged. Or lastly, the last 2 short stories we will be reading, so you can see that we're coming to the conclusion of the short story unit. You can compare and contrast Kincaid's Girl with Carver's Popular Mechanics. Both are very short stories. They're approximately a page and a half long or so, and we will be talking about them over the next couple classes. But because they're so short, you might feel more comfortable discussing both of them. They are the more contemporary stories that we are reading in this particular unit. With, as I indicated in the handout, a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? That's a tall order, and you can see that I've documented where I got that information from in parentheses, parenthetical documentation, author's last name, Biddle, the page number 9. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the conventions of documentation as well. While you aren't using outside sources probably for this paper, you do need to quote from the pieces of literature themselves. So we will review that, since I believe you would have probably had some exposure to the MLA system, or the Modern Language Association system, in your previous English class, English 101. And this is the system that we use for documentation in the humanities, and that includes languages, which of course includes English. But again, I don't want to assume too much, so again, we will be talking about some of the details of this over the next several classes. And keep in mind that these paper questions, or suggested paper questions, could also lead you to investigations in your journal writing as well. And your journal isn't due until the ending of the short story unit, so we've got a little bit of time, but you can certainly submit in your journal early once you've responded to 3 short stories. So now that we've talked in rather a good amount of depth with A Sorrowful Woman and The Story of an Hour and A Rose for Emily, I gave you 3 short stories for today that are very different from one another. I thought I would introduce all 3 today, and then we could continue to discuss them next class in terms of some of the specifics of language. But the first is Young Goodman Brown. And this was written in 1835. You have to keep that in mind when you're reading the text. So the language will probably sound quite archaic. And it's a text that's set in Massachusetts, in Salem. So this gives us a bit of a historical view of our society in Massachusetts during this time period, and perhaps can explain some of the elements of our current society in Massachusetts. And this is on page 321 of the edition of the text that I ordered for us for class. But you can see that I've also included a link. Whenever the pieces of literature are available, I've included links. And that this story is an allegory, which means that the entire story is supposed to be representational, figurative, symbolic. And I think you can see that with just some of the character names. Young Goodman Brown is obviously an individual, but he's also supposed to represent a young, good man. And Faith is obviously a specific individual, his wife, but she also represents his faith, his religious faith, and also his faith in humanity. In order to truly understand the story, you need to understand a little bit about Puritanism, which was a very strict religious doctrine at the time period. You know anything at all about the Puritans? They basically saw good and evil as two opposites with nothing in between. And they were persecuted in England, so they left and basically formed settlements in New England. This was the New England, Massachusetts in particular, since this is one of the earliest places of settlement. And then the hypocrisy, they began persecuting others who didn't follow their religious doctrines. In fact, they were responsible for the Salem witch trials, which you've probably heard of, where basically it was an attempt to persecute individuals who followed different belief systems. Usually these were women who were outside of the social system, accusing them of witchcraft. And that history is a history that Nathaniel Hawthorne was quite aware of, because his own family, previous generations, had been involved in the persecution of the witch trials. He was quite embarrassed and quite felt quite guilty about it all, so much so that he actually changed the spelling of his last name from Hathorne to Hawthorne, to try to distance himself from that. But his writing oftentimes examines that ugly period in our history, almost like William Faulkner was examining the ugly period of Southern slavery in much of his Southern Gothic writing, as we saw in A Rose for Emily. Note that Goodman would be a title at the time, much like Mr., but it also represents a good man. And the fact that Goodman is young, and think about all of the associations with youth, innocence, and being naive. And Brown, of course, we could think about possible color symbolism. The story takes place in the wilderness, a place that's wild or untamed, not subject necessarily to the laws of man or society. And that color imagery works in terms of the soil that you would find in a forest or a wilderness. And one could say that this story is about soil and what happens when we become soiled with sin, or what happens when we acknowledge that we are all soiled with sin. Again, that would be a revolutionary idea in Puritanism, the fact that one is not necessarily purely good, but that everyone has some level of sin within them. And it begins, its setting, with sunset. We know that the times of the day oftentimes are symbolic. This represents descent or darkness. And we know that Goodman Brown and his wife are newlyweds, which again represents the beginnings. This idea of innocence and being naive. They've been married for 3 months. 3 is a very important Christian symbol. I believe I had mentioned this with Rose for Emily as well. She spent 3 days before being able to give up her father's corpse. And then, of course, in the Faulkner interview, he talks about how Emily had violated the Christian laws of God, because 3 is a very significant number in Christianity, representational of Trinity. So obviously religion is embedded in this. And this Goodman Brown leaves on this errand, even though Faith tries to hold him back. He knows it's not an errand of good, but he does it anyway, which illustrates already that Goodman has some evil within his soul, or at least curiosity about things that could lead to evil. And he encounters a mysterious figure that seems to be the devil, but may not necessarily be the devil. I talked about deliberate ambiguity. And in this story, we will see lots of undercutting where it seems that this traveler's staff moves like a snake. Of course, snake has biblical associations when you think about the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. But then we're undercut with the statement that this must have been an ocular deception, which is another way of saying this must be a figment of someone's imagination. I must be seeing things. So, what we see in his journey in the wilderness is that he encounters a good number of people, individuals that he thought were free of sin. And because it seems that they're all traveling to the same place, seemingly a witch meeting in Salem, that would suggest that they all have some level of corruption, including the church leaders, and it also includes Goody Cloyce, which is so horrific to Goodman because she taught him his catechism. In other words, she was his Sunday school teacher. Politicians, professionals, widows, family members, all of these individuals are tainted because they are all encountered by Goodman. But I would suggest that Goodman is tainted as well because he is part of the journey. And in the ending of the piece, we don't necessarily know if the witch meeting actually occurred or if this was a hallucination or a dream of Goodman's. In fact, the author directly asked the question, was this a dream of evil omen for Goodman Brown? And the response is, be it so if you will. That basically, if you want to believe that, that's fine, but it's unimportant. What does matter is how Goodman changes as a result of this. That humanity is ambiguous. It's filled with good and evil, but that's a lesson that Goodman is unable to grasp. And he basically, confronted with the possibility of evil and hypocrisy in his society, decides to become a darkly meditative and isolated individual who basically, when he dies, has no hopeful verse upon his tomb. In other words, he leads a very sad and solitary life that's filled with sternness. And the lesson for us is that we should not follow Goodman's footsteps, literally or figuratively, and that just because we acknowledge or come to the realization that there is evil and hypocrisy within others and even within ourselves, that should not lead to the destruction or loss of our faith in humanity, in ourselves, and in our spiritual beliefs. So that is a very quick overview of young Goodman Brown. If you remember, I had talked about different ways to examine literature, and there is one school entitled The Deconstructionist Thought of Analysis, where it deliberately looks for contradiction, and that contradiction, because it exists, is supposed to negate meaning within the text. Young Goodman Brown is a wonderful example of a text that could be examined with the deconstructionist method, because every time there is a piece of evidence to seem to show that the events are occurring, there is another piece of evidence to counteract that. So basically, we come up with no clear definitive answer, but I would suggest that in and of itself makes this text quite accurate for humanity, because we also are filled with ambiguity, good and evil at the same time. So therefore that lack of clarity in the text just illustrates the lack of clarity that exists within all of us. And I had mentioned contemporary times. If you've ever wondered why in some towns in New England, for instance, Greenfield is one of them, why you can't buy liquor on a Sunday morning, it's because of the Puritans, and that they felt that was the time for worship. And of course, we live on a border or close to a border, so there was a little bit of business negotiation that went on. So the negotiation was that you could sell liquor on a Sunday after 12 o'clock, which would be after the services or the religious services would be done, but not before. And that's called the Blue Law, and it still exists. So we still have remnants of Puritan society in New England in contemporary times, even within our own community. But as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about Goodman Brown and some of the specifics of language next class, because I wanted to give you an overview of Soldier's Home. This was written by Ernest Hemingway, 1925. It's on page 162. This is a more contemporary piece, and Ernest Hemingway is also known for being a more contemporary writer. And oftentimes readers like him because his style tends to be pretty concise and pretty simple, but that said, it's not at all simplistic. And this title, Soldier's Home, leads to the question of what is home? And there is a difference between a house, the physical structure, and home, the place where you feel wanted and understood. And this is about a soldier who's returning home, though if you wanted to make some comparisons with other situations, think about any, let's say, adult child who leaves home, college for instance, and then returns and realizes that things have changed. Or perhaps it's not so much that things have changed, but that they've changed. And the time period of this story, 1925, is particularly important because there really wasn't an understanding of what we call PTSD. At the time, it was known as shell shock. And in fact, we might say that even in contemporary times, we don't have a true understanding of PTSD. The military and service in the military would have been portrayed as a patriotic, honorable duty, and there would be very little public discussion about some of the possible negatives associated with serving in the military. So this story would be very eyebrow-raising because it shows us some of the negatives. Much like Young Goodman Brown would have been very eye-raising as well. The idea that Puritanism was a very simplistic way of viewing the complexity of humanity. So, Krebs, by the way, in German stands for cancer, and one might say that war itself is like a cancer, it continues to grow, and that it ultimately impacts the survivors. And that's what we see with Krebs as a veteran when he returns back. Notice he's referred to so frequently as Krebs, which is his military name, his surname, and the use of the surname in the military is to remove individuality. And we see that he comes back a very different person than what he left. In the very beginning, we're introduced to two pictures, and they're both very important. The first is of Krebs with his fraternity brothers in college. They're all wearing the same height and style of collar. In some ways, you might say that a fraternity is a kind of preparation for military, and that there is a sense of a loss of individuality. But certainly we see the military picture that is the ugly reality and not at all the glorified fiction that would have been prevalent at the time. The uniforms don't fit. The girls aren't pretty. You can't even see the rind. And again, the way the military would have been sold at the time for men, and it would have been for men at that time period, that the military was a place to see the world, such as the Rhine, but you don't even see that in the picture. The military is a place where you could be impressive in uniform. And, of course, the uniforms don't fit. And lastly, the military could be a place where you could be impressive to the opposite sex. And here, again, the girls are not pretty. Questioning of religion, I think, occurs in this text as well, as we saw with Young Goodman Brown, and that we know that Krebs attended a Methodist college, and we definitely know that his mother is religious. In fact, she urges him to pray, and he's unable to do so. So we assume that religion has at least been an important part of his life on some level, and yet, probably because of the horrors of war, he finds it very difficult to show love to anyone or anything, and certainly to show faith in his religion or in any kind of sense of a higher power, which is why he has difficulty praying. Of course, the age-old question of how do you embrace religion when there's so much horror in the world. We see quite a bit about the civilians who don't greet Krebs with the hero's welcome because he comes, quote, after the hero's greetings are over, unquote, which says a great deal about the fickle nature of civilians, that once the war is no longer interesting or exciting, individuals who participated in the war are no longer viewed as interesting or exciting, even though their service was just as important as those before them. And we see Krebs's isolation. Notice how he spends time in solitary activities. He's having a great amount of difficulty reintegrating back into society. His parents would like him to be, quote, normal, unquote. That means get a job. That means have a relationship. That means marriage. That means to reintegrate back in a way that Krebs is not able to. Perhaps he may never be able to. But again, society is not understanding of that. His solitary activities, where he's spending time reading, he's eating lunch at home, he's playing pool, he's practicing clarinet, all things that he can do on his own. In fact, pool I think is particularly important because with pool, one has to aim and shoot, which is what he would have done in the military, aiming and shooting. Again, Faulkner. I should say Hemingway is a very deliberate author. There's a detail in there. For instance, the father didn't like his paper mussed up. The father basically doesn't want his life mussed up. The father wants everything to be in order and wants Krebs to basically follow the expectations of society. In fact, the parents aren't above trying to bribe Krebs. They offer him the family car, something that he would not have had access to previous to the war. But Krebs is not interested because he understands that it comes with conditions. The idea behind the car, the assumption is that he would use the car to travel for work, or he would use the car for developing a relationship, or both. Again, he's not necessarily ready for either one of those things. He does not want consequences in his life. One assumes because of the multiple consequences that he had to address in war, life and death consequences. He does talk about how he would be interested in relationship, but he's not interested in emotional intimacy because that means a certain level of vulnerability. He liked to look at the girls, but he didn't want to talk to them. I think it's quite telling that he misses the German girls because ultimately when he was at war, the women were not fluent probably in English. So those relationships were likely either devoted to superficial conversation or to no conversation, and probably were guided by physicality as opposed to emotional intimacy, which is one of the reasons why he says that he does not want to commit to a relationship. He doesn't want to commit to much of anything. This is a very dialogue-driven piece, which makes it easier to read when you've got a good amount of dialogue. His conversation with his sister could be eyebrow-raising. Note that his sister refers to him as Hare. That's a nickname, H-A-R-E. And that probably shows that he has a closer relationship with his sister because she is using a nickname. A hare, H-A-R-E, is a rabbit. One could say that Krebs is much like a scared rabbit when he returns back home. But when she asks, "Look, can you be my beau or boyfriend?" It's not with romantic or sexual intent. We should read it more as just an innocent question of hero worship, where a younger sister is stating something much like a young child might state with the parent, not understanding that, of course not, they could never have a serious relationship. But note that probably the closest relationship Krebs has is with his sister. His mother attempts to understand them. It does call him Harold, so that shows that they have more of an intimate relationship, or at least they have more of a connection. Nevertheless, the mother wants to basically have Krebs return to the state he was prior to entering into the military. And even more tellingly, perhaps, is that Krebs never has a direct conversation with his father. We don't know what the relationship was with his father prior to the war, but we definitely know that it's quite distanced now. And the ending where Krebs decides that he will go to Kansas City, get a job, and he will watch his sister play indoor baseball can be read in a lot of different ways. It could be read as a positive because Krebs is trying to reintegrate back into society. It could be viewed as a negative because Krebs is basically running away. Rather than trying to confront his family with his issues, he's going to go to Kansas City and do what they want him to do. Perhaps this is Krebs' smartest move, understanding that he's never going to be able to change his family, so the only person he can change is himself. Like most things in life, I think it's a complicated ending with both positive and negative possibilities. We don't know what happens to Krebs afterwards when he does go to Kansas City and gets a job, whether that's healing for him or whether that's just a way to mask the trauma that he's experienced, or perhaps a little bit of both. But the questions that this piece raises is perhaps more important than the answers, especially during the time period where it really wasn't understood that veterans returning home really weren't home yet, that in many ways they were still in the war emotionally and intellectually. And that's something that I hope that we have a better understanding of in our time period, in part perhaps because of stories like this that really raise that question in a way that hadn't been raised publicly. And again, I'll revisit this story as well and talk a little bit about some language next class. But Battle Royal, the last story that I wanted to talk about, and this is part of a novel, Invisible Man, not The Invisible Man, which is a short story, or which is a science fiction story, I should say, about somebody who literally becomes invisible. But this particular piece, Invisible Man, is about the story of our protagonist who feels he is invisible because he isn't seen as an individual. He is black and he is viewed merely by the color of his skin. This piece very much exposes much of the racism of the time period, as well as some of the sexism of the time period as well. Again, another piece I think that helped to lay the foundation for some of the ways that over time, basically, we've made some changes to our society. That's not to say that we still don't deal with the ugly reality of racism or sexism. And this Invisible Man is reflecting back on his youth. So, what we've got is an adult who's telling us about his time when he had finished high school and he was given accolades for his graduation speech, so much so that he was supposed to present to some of the leading citizens of the town. And while he's quite excited because he thinks that he can show them his great intellect, what it ends up being is a time for humiliation and degradation. The leading citizens of the town reminds me almost of young Goodman Brown, seeing some of the leading citizens of his society at this witch meeting, or at the supposed witch meeting. But in this instance, we've got the leading men, the leading male citizens of the town, the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers, and all of them are basically gathered for a battle royal that the protagonist is not aware of, that there is going to be a literal boxing match that has already been fixed, so that as all of these young black men are fighting one another, in the end, as they're bloodied and beaten, again a metaphor for the battles that African Americans fight on a daily basis in society. The two that are left happen to be the Invisible Man and the biggest and baddest fighter of all. And while the Invisible Man tries to convince the other fighter to basically fix the fight so that they can stop fighting and collect their prize, is very tellingly told, no, I won't do that, I'm fighting for myself. This is the only way for the other fighter to get any kind of degree of respect or honor, as we see how they're all fighting against each other for the crumbs, in effect. You can say that that's a similar parallel from an economic perspective when we talk about the 99% fighting against perhaps the 1% in our society. But the humiliation and the degradation of the physical battle doesn't end there. Afterwards, they have to actually scramble for their prize money, which ends up not being even real prize money. So again, it's all fake. Again, saying that the promises that America offers are quite fake. Something that we saw earlier on when the men are humiliated and embarrassed sexually, when a naked blonde woman is presented to them and they can't help but show their sexual excitement. They're wearing very little clothing, just boxing shorts, so their erections are evident. That's something they can't hide, and something that could lead in actually to their being in one way or another punished or even killed. And this gives us a sense of the kind of racism that existed at the time period. And that woman is supposed to be representational of the American dream, as we see with the tattoo of the American flag that is on her body. You can look, but you can't touch, and that the American dream is just a facade. And ultimately, the woman is rushed out of the room. The Invisible Man talking about how he feels a sense of lust for her, but also a sense of protectiveness for her, too, and how he's trying to balance those two things. But then at the ending of that, and the boxing match, and the scrambling for the fake money, where they are electrocuted, actually, which goes to a major theme in the novel that we don't necessarily get with the short story about power, because electricity is about power, the power company, if you want to think about it that way. Finally, the Invisible Man is able to give his speech, and again, no one is really paying attention until he happens to make an error. Or one could say that that slip of the tongue was really a expression of his subconscious, where instead of saying social responsibility, he says social equality. Everything comes to a halt at that point, and he apologizes and says that it was a misstatement. He was swallowing blood. That's both literal and figurative. At the ending, he is presented with a scholarship to the quote Negro unquote college, and it's in a briefcase being very representational of success and the business world. He's quite happy, but he's haunted by a nightmare with his grandfather, because the story Invisible Man tells us begins with his grandfather prior to the speech, where his grandfather died and told the family on his deathbed that he'd been a traitor all of his days, and that one should live with their head in the lion's mouth and be a spy in the enemy's country. In other words, the grandfather was pretending to be meek and conciliatory towards Caucasian society, but really it was his way to infiltrate so that he could try to overthrow the system. This is something the Invisible Man does not understand and will not understand until years later. So after the Invisible Man gets his scholarship, and he's actually standing underneath the portrait of his grandfather, I can't help but think of Miss Emily and the crayon portrait of her father that's always present in the house. But nevertheless, the dream he has is of a circus, and his grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. In other words, his grandfather refuses to do what is expected of him. And the grandfather basically tells him to open up an envelope, and it's one envelope inside another, inside another. It almost reminds you of those Russian nesting dolls. And basically, he's told that he's going to be kept running for the rest of his days. And yes, the N word is used. So again, this gives us a sense of the historical time period. To give you an idea of the novel, because you are at a disadvantage because you haven't read the novel. So I just wanted to end today by telling you a little bit about the novel, and then we could talk about each of these 3 short stories more in depth next class. The novel Invisible Man begins with the adult Invisible Man, who's basically broken into a basement in an all-Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed entrance into. And he's surrounded by darkness because he's in the basement, but he also has stolen electricity from the electric company, or from the power company, and he's rigged up thousands of electric lights, or at least hundreds of electric lights around him. So he's surrounded by darkness, but also illumination, which works very nicely symbolically for the novel. And he tells us that he's an invisible man, but he needs to explain how he learned he was invisible. And the first chapter happens to be Battle Royal, where he, as a teenager, is asked to give a speech to the leading citizens of the town. And we see how he's humiliated and degraded, though his major concern at this point is still trying to impress his audience. And he doesn't really understand how empty and hollow the promise is of a scholarship at the ending of the story. Because in the novel, for the next couple hundred pages or so following, he does go to college on that scholarship, and he finds out that it's all been a lie, that despite the promise that education can lead to opportunity and to equality, that is not his situation because of the color of his skin, and will never be the situation because of the color of his skin. So he decides that since that isn't going to be the answer to achieve the American dream, and the American dream is quite relevant in this story, what he's going to try to do is to change the political system. And he spends the next couple hundred pages trying to change the political system and realizes it's just as rigged as the educational system. That although the political system promises all men are created equal, that of course leaves out 50% of the population female. And that doesn't necessarily include all men, it includes a very small portion of men based on ethnicity and class and religion. And he realizes that the political system is just as corrupt as the educational system. And that is not the answer in terms of achieving equality and a certain level of dignity and honor. So he ends up meeting a character who's very aptly named. He's named Ross the Destroyer because he does indeed believe in destruction. And Ross the Destroyer convinces the Invisible Man, who's never named, because he is indeed invisible. He isn't given an identity. I can't help but think of a sorrowful woman in this instance with no names. But nevertheless, Ross the Destroyer convinces the Invisible Man that basically they need to destroy society. They need to revolt and have revolution and start afresh. And they spend the next couple hundred pages trying to do that. And when their community is literally burning around them in a series of riots, the Invisible Man realizes that this is not the answer either. So what he decides to do is to break into a basement in a Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed in, where he is surrounded by darkness, but he is stealing power from the power company. So he's also rigged up hundreds of electric lights. In other words, the ending of the novel is circular to the beginning of the novel. And he basically says he's hibernating. And if you think about the meaning of hibernating, it's basically kind of a timeout, that he's thinking and contemplating as to what he can do in order to achieve the American dream and to achieve equality in society. And we aren't given an answer as to how to do that, which I think is the brilliance of Ralph Ellison, the author, that instead of giving us an easy answer for one of our biggest social ills, racism, that he challenges us, the reader, to try to supply that. The piece was written in the 1940s, so you can get a sense of the kinds of discrimination and racism that would have existed in the time period and perhaps still does exist in our current time period. But I'm also hopeful that it's pieces like this that have led to some of the advances that have been made since the 1940s in terms of race and in terms of gender and also in terms of class. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of all three short stories. As I said, I'll talk about language a little bit more next class. What's left is our attendance question. So as you know, you've got 48 hours to respond to your attendance question. So this will be due on Thursday, on the 16th at noon. So if you need an extension, please ask me. And out of the three stories that I've covered today, which story did you like the least and why? Which story did you like the least and why? We're oftentimes talking about that which we like the best. Of course, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. I'm more interested in your reasoning and your thought process. Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses. This will give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with these three short stories and also talk about the last two short stories in our unit, and that would be Girl and Popular Mechanics. Take care. Bye-bye.